"A quiet cowboy speaks with his hands," said the frontier girl, after he rebuilt her burned farm. "The first nail I drove into her ruined place, I drove wrong. Bent it sideways with the second. Hit the hammer too cold that morning. My grip still stiff from sleeping in the wagon bed, and I had to claw it back out of the charred beam and start again. That's the thing about a ruined foundation. You think you know where to start, and then the ground tells you otherwise." Her name was Cora Ellison. I didn't know that yet. I just knew the smoke. I'd been moving east along the Powder River Basin for 3 weeks. Not in a hurry, which is to say I had nowhere to be. Job up near Buffalo had paid out. My horse, a gray quarter horse I called Biscuit on account of his color, was sound and well fed. I had enough in my coat pocket for another month if I was careful. I wasn't looking for anything. That's usually when you find it. The smoke was 4 days old by the time I came on it. Not wood smoke, not campfire, the particular dead cold smell of a place that burned and finished burning. Heavier. It sits in your lungs different. I'd known it before, and not from a long time ago. I came over a low rise and there it was. What had been a farmstead, a house, and a barn, and what might have been a chicken coop on the east side was mostly ash and standing timber, black and crooked against the November sky. A stone chimney held, part of a back wall. The barn frame was still up, barely. 2 of the uprights leaning toward each other like 2 men too tired to fight. Everything else was down. And there was a woman in the middle of it. Not crying. Not even looking at what was gone. She was moving through the ash with a short-handled shovel, pulling things out of it, a pot, a length of chain, a cast-iron skillet so blackened it was near indistinguishable from the ruin around it. She was putting them in a wool blanket spread on the ground to her left, working methodically. She had a kerchief over her nose and mouth against the ash, and she was wearing men's work boots that were too big. I stopped Biscuit on the rise and sat for a moment. She hadn't heard me. I could have kept riding. The basin was wide and open, and the cold season trail to Gillette was another 6 hours southeast. I didn't keep riding. I don't know if I can explain that in a way that sounds like sense. It wasn't heroics. It wasn't that I thought she couldn't manage. Looking at her work that shovel, I could see plain enough she was managing. It was something else, some particular quality of the scene. A woman alone in a field of ash in November, doing the next necessary thing with nobody there to see it. Something about that hit me in a place I don't have good words for. I came down off the rise slow, so she'd hear me coming. She stopped and looked up, shovel across both hands, and she didn't move back. Sized me up the way a person does when they've been on their own long enough that they've gotten accurate about it. I was not a young man. I was 53 that fall, which is not old, but which shows on a working man the hands and the posture and the way you move through cold air. I had a beard I'd let go through October, a canvas coat, a rifle across the saddle that I kept there, because the country was wide and honest about what it required. She pulled the kerchief down. "You passing through?" she said. "Was," I said. She looked at me another moment. Looked at the ruined barn frame. Looked back at me. "I can't pay you," she said. Didn't ask. There's a long silence in a story like that, where the next thing has to be decided. She decided it. "Then you'd better put that horse somewhere out of the wind," she said. "And I'll tell you what's down, and what isn't. My name is Harlan Wick. I was born in Tennessee, 1832, which put me 18 when my father drove us to Missouri in a wagon that barely made it to the territory line, and 29 when the war took both of my brothers and most of what I'd known up to that point. I don't tell this to anybody, but you should know the shape of a man before you understand what it means when he picks up a hammer. I spent 20 years after the war moving. Not running. Moving. There's a difference, though it took me a long time to see it. I worked cattle drives out of Texas in the early 70s. I did mine labor in Colorado, which I hated, but the winters were survivable and the work was honest and there wasn't much required of me by way of conversation. I did fence work, well digging, barn raising for ranchers along the Platte and the Niobrara. I was good with my hands. I am good with my hands. That's not pride, it's inventory. A man alone needs to know what he has to work with. I had been married, once. Her name was Ruth. and she died of a fever in 1871, in a soddy, on the Kansas plains. And that is all I will say about that, because even now, this many years later, there are things a man keeps. By the time I came over that rise above Cora Ellison's burned farm, I had been on my own for 12 years. I wasn't unhappy, or I'd stopped knowing the difference between unhappy and just the particular quiet of a life lived alone, which fills up on you gradual so you don't notice the shape of what's missing until something shows you the outline of it. That, too, is something I only understood later. Her husband had been dead 2 years. He wasn't killed, or not directly. He was swept off a horse crossing the Powder in spring flood, trying to move cattle to the north pasture, and they found him 3 miles downstream 2 days later. She'd buried him herself because the nearest neighbor was 7 miles and the ground wasn't going to wait. She'd run the place since then. 60 acres, a small herd, 2 pigs she'd given up on keeping alive through the previous winter, a milk cow she'd managed to hold on to, 1 man who'd drifted through and worked for wages until last August, when he'd gotten the itch and headed for the territorial line. The fire was lightning. She said it plain, no feeling in it, the way you say a thing you've already worked through every angle of and come out the other side too tired to be angry. The storm came on fast, a dry storm, the kind that comes down off the Black Hills in late October, with more lightning than sense. The barn took a strike. The house caught from the barn. She got the cow out and the horse out and the dog out, and she stood in the dark and the rain and watched 20 years of her life go. She told me all of this the first night, sitting on a bedroll in the back of her wagon because there was nowhere else to sit. She had a lantern. I had coffee I'd made on a fire I'd built in the lee of the stone chimney because the wind was up and mean. She didn't fuss over the telling. She stated it. I listened and didn't say anything, which I think was the right choice, though I wouldn't have known how to make a wrong one. At some point in the middle of that night, I asked her what she needed first. She thought about it seriously, which I respected. Roof, she said. Something with a roof. The house or the barn. I can't winter through in the wagon. The barn frame is sounder than it looks, I said. If we sister the uprights and get the crossbeams settled, we can roof it inside 2 weeks. Use it through winter, and start the house in spring. She looked at me in the lamplight. You know barn raising. I know most things, I said, and then caught myself, because that sounds like bragging. I've done it before, is what I mean. Enough times I know the order of things. She nodded. She pulled the lantern between her and me, and we sat for a while with no particular reason to keep talking, and the wind went over us. I'm Cora, she said. Harlan, I said. And that was the arrangement. I'll tell you about the work, because the work was where everything lived. I've done a lot of building in my life. Fence posts and well casings and roof joists and sod walls and all manner of things that needed to stand up against the weight of sky and weather and time. Every job has its own logic. You learn it by listening to the materials. Wood tells you things if you pay attention. The direction of the grain, the weight and give of a beam when you set it on your shoulder. The particular sound a green board makes versus a seasoned one. A bad fit makes a sound. So does a good one. The barn at Cora's place had been built by her husband 15 years prior. And whatever else could be said about the man, he'd built with care. The upright posts were good-sized timber, anchored deep, and even with the fire and the leaning they were mostly sound inside. I walked every inch of that frame the second morning, pressing my hand against each post, looking up the grain for cracks. I pulled 2 posts that had to go, and left 8 that could stay. She watched me do this. She didn't offer opinions, and she didn't get in the way, but she watched with attention, and when I'd circle back past her, she'd hand me a coffee cup or pass me a nail without being asked, because she'd learned already to read where I was in the work. That's not a small thing. I've built beside men who couldn't do it. We settled into a rhythm in those first few days that felt, and I'm choosing my words here, familiar. Not because I knew her, because the rhythm itself was one I recognized. 2 people working in shared purpose, each one knowing their part, no energy wasted on the filling up of silence. There is a kind of ease in that. A rightness. I'd had it with Ruth, years ago, and I'd missed it without ever having a name for it. The days were cold and short. We worked from first light until we lost it around 4, and then I'd build the fire and she'd cook. She was a good cook. Plain food, made careful. And she fed me like I mattered, which is a thing I didn't take for granted. And then we'd sit by the fire, or in the wagon, and she'd sometimes read from a book she had, a collection of poems and letters from some Eastern publication, and I'd work on something in my hands, sharpening or mending, or just keeping my fingers busy the way they need to be when the rest of me is still. She talked more than I did. I'm used to that. Most people do. But she didn't talk the way some people do, filling the air to avoid the quiet. She talked when she had something to say, and when she didn't, she was comfortable being quiet, and I liked both equally. The 8th day out, I was up on the frame setting the ridgepole. It was 12 feet off the ground, and I'd walked beams at height before, but the cold was working on my hands, and I came down wrong on a crossbeam, just a misstep, my boot skidding on the frost-slick wood, and I grabbed the ridgepole and caught myself, but not before my whole body lurched sideways, and my stomach went out from under me. I held there a moment, heart hammering, feeling the cold of the wood through my gloves. Below me, she said nothing. But when I looked down, she was standing with both hands up, not reaching, just positioned her arms up, her eyes on me, her face completely steady. She wasn't going to catch me if I fell. I was 12 feet up, and she was 5'4". But she was there. She was not going to look away. I got my feet under me, and finished setting the ridgepole. When I climbed down, she handed me coffee and said, "You need me up there with you tomorrow?" I looked at her. "I'm not afraid of heights," she said. "I shingled this roof the first time myself. I'll take the help," I said, and she nodded like that settled it. What I want to tell you about is something that happened in the 3rd week, because it's the thing I think of most when I think of that fall. We were finishing the barn walls. I'd sourced lumber from a mill down near Casey, gone down there on biscuit with the last of my pocket money and her savings combined. Neither of us saying much about the arithmetic of it, and we were working one of the long sidewalls together, me holding a plank level while she drove the nails. She was good with a hammer, not in a labored proof-something way, just competent and economical, the way a person gets when they've done a thing enough times. She hit a nail wrong, not wrong, just at a slight angle, and the plank shifted a hair as she corrected it, and my fingers were in the wrong place. She drove the next nail and caught the side of my left index finger along the edge of the head. Not bad. A scrape, a wedge of skin, the sudden sharp bite of it. I made a sound. Pulled my hand back. She turned immediately. Took my hand without asking. Turned it toward the light. Looked at the finger. The cut was minor, I could tell that before she said anything, but she held my hand there for a moment longer than she needed to. Her thumb braced under my fingers, and she said, low and even, "I'm sorry, Harlan." 2 words. They shouldn't have done what they did. But there was something in the way she held my hand, not urgency, not fuss, just the full attention of another person who cared whether you were all right, that came in under my ribs and stayed there. I am not good at talking about things. I'm telling you this the only way I know how, which is to describe the physical facts of it. Her hand around mine, the cold air, the smell of cut pine and iron, the particular still quality of her, looking at a small wound, like it was the most important thing in the world to her in that moment. I said, "It's nothing." Because it was. "I know," she said. But she didn't let go right away. She wrapped it with a strip of cloth from her kit anyway. Made me hold still for it. And then we went back to work. That night she was quieter than usual. I was too. We ate and sat by the fire and didn't reach for words. And the silence between us had changed some heavier, but not uncomfortable. More like a thing acknowledged. I stayed up after she went to the wagon to sleep. I sat by the dying fire and watched the half-built barn against the stars, the ridgepole clean against the sky, the new boards pale in the moonlight where they caught it, the stone chimney standing the way it had stood, through everything. And I thought about what I was doing here, not the building. I knew what I was doing with the building. I mean here. In this valley. On this particular stretch of ground. With this particular woman's coffee. In my cup. And the memory of her hands. Still in my hands. I was not a young man. I had not been young for a long time. I had spent a decade and more in the particular discipline of wanting nothing, because wanting nothing is easier than wanting something and not having it, and I had gotten good at it. I was expert at it. I thought about that for a long time in the cold and the dark. And then I went to sleep. The barn was done, in 26 days. I mean done, roofed, sided. The stalls rebuilt. A small loft for hay. A Dutch door I was quietly proud of, because the fit was clean. The hinges were ones I'd made myself from bar iron, shaped on a flat rock, and punched cold because I didn't have a forge, and they hung square and swung without binding. I hung that door and opened and closed it several times, just to hear the way it moved. Cora came out of the wagon and stood looking at it. She walked around the outside, ran her hand along the south wall, put her shoulder against one of the uprights and tested it, which was unnecessary because I'd set those posts in 3 feet of tamped earth, and they weren't going anywhere in her lifetime. She came back around to the door and stood looking up at the whole of it. She didn't say anything for a moment. And then she said, "You built this." "We built it," I said. She shook her head. "Slow. You know the difference," she said. "I handed you things. You drove half the nails on the east wall. Harlan." She said my name like she was asking me to stop deflecting, which I was. She turned and looked at me directly, the way she had that day on the beam. Steady. Full attention. "You came over that hill with your bedroll and your hammer, and you rebuilt what I lost. That's what you did." I didn't have anything to say to that. I'm not built for receiving things. She must have seen that, because she didn't press. She looked at the barn again. "What's your plan?" she said. "My plan. You were moving east." "You still moving east?" I looked at the barn. At the stone chimney. At the cold, clear sky over the valley. I hadn't thought that far. I said. That was true. I'd been measuring in days this crossbeam, that rafter, the Dutch door. And I hadn't let myself look past the work. That's a discipline I've always been good at, and it had served me, mostly. "I have 60 acres, she said. "Come spring, there's a house to build. And I can't run this place alone through the whole of it." She paused. "I'm not asking for charity. I'm asking you to win her over and help me get the house up in spring. And if you need wages, I'll find them somewhere. And if you'll take payment another way." She stopped. There was a silence that meant something. "What other way?" I said. She looked at the ground for a moment and then back at me, and there was something in her face that was not uncertain, because she was not a woman given to uncertainty, but careful. Like she'd thought about this and was going to say it anyway. "I'd ask you to stay," she said. "Past spring. I'd ask you to stay and make this your place too, if that's something you can imagine." The cold air came down off the ridge and moved through the new barn and out the other side. I want to be careful how I say this, because I'm not a man who dramatizes things, and I don't want to dramatize this. But I will tell you that I stood there for what felt like a long time, with the sound of that sentence still in the air between us, and I understood with a clarity I had not felt in a long time what it meant, not what she was offering me, which was plain enough, but what it meant that she was offering it. That this woman, who had buried her husband herself and run 60 acres alone for 2 years, and stood in the rain and watched everything burn, and got up the next morning and started pulling things out of the ash with a short-handled shovel. The woman had looked at me, a 53-year-old drifting carpenter with a gray horse and no particular future, and seen something worth asking to stay. I've carried a lot of things in my life that weren't worth the weight. I don't carry this one the same way. "All right," I said. She nodded. She was not a woman who cried. Or if she was, she didn't do it in front of me. What she did was step forward and put both arms around my chest and press her face against my shoulder. And I put my arms around her and held on to her in the cold outside the barn we'd built together, and neither of us said anything. I could feel her breathing. That's what I remember. The particular steadiness of it. I'm telling you this in the spring of 1887. The house is up, framed and sided and roofed. 3 rooms and a proper kitchen, and a bedroom with a window that faces east, because she asked for one that faced east. I set the window frames myself. The casings are mitered clean. Last week her neighbor's boy came over. He's 12 and curious, always hanging around when there's building or fixing happening, and he watched me for most of an afternoon while I was putting up the porch rail. And then he asked me how I knew where to put the posts. I showed him. "How you sight down the line. how you feel for square, how the wood tells you when the fit is right. He watched my hands the whole time, and when I drove the last post, he said, real serious like a 12-year-old will, your hands know what they're doing. I didn't say anything, but I thought of Cora. The first time she'd said something like that, different words, the same idea to me. Said it to the boy's mother, actually, not to me, over the fence one afternoon. Said it like it was the simplest fact in the world. That quiet cowboy, she said. He speaks with his hands. I don't know that I'd ever been described before in a way that felt entirely right. But that one was right. Cora comes out on the porch in the mornings now with 2 cups, and we stand and look at what we've built, the barn, the house, the fence lines straight across the valley floor, and sometimes she says something, and sometimes neither of us does. The valley smells like spring mud and cut grass, and the particular nothing of cold, clean air coming down off the ridge. I am not a man who expected this. I am not sure I deserved it, in the arithmetic of things. But she decided otherwise, and she made her decision plain. And I have learned over these months that when a good woman looks at you and tells you that you're worth staying for, the right response is not to argue with her. The porch rail is solid. I tested it this morning. It'll hold. That's enough to know.